美国历史上最杰出的 CEO 之一，他2002年出任著名的多元化高科技制造企业霍尼韦尔 CEO 时，这家成立于1885年的百年老店人心涣散，摇摇欲坠。高德威拯救并再造了霍尼韦尔，他执政15年。这期间，霍尼韦尔营收翻倍，市值增长6倍，股东回报高达800%，是同期标准普尔500指数涨幅的2.5倍。高德威高度重视全球化，2002年美国市场占霍尼韦尔营收的60%。他2017年卸任时，霍尼韦尔有55%的营收来自美国以外，其中23%来自中国、印度等高增长市场。高德威高度重视中国市场，坚信如果不能在中国成功，那么在其他地方的成功都没有意义。他上任时，霍尼韦尔中国的员工不到1000人，高管全是外籍人士，年销售额3亿多美元。2017年，霍尼韦尔中国有1.3万名员工，其中只有75名外籍人士，年销售额30亿美元，利润率超过美国市场。高德威近日接受了我的专访，重点讨论了企业全球化问题，这是中国企业界当下的焦点话题。美国能否重振制造业也是访谈的重点。There has been a very popular saying in recent years in China, "Go globalization, otherwise go out of business." So Honeywell did very good in globalization when you in the office of CEO and chairman. I'm wondering, is there any general rules?
Yeah, I think so. Going back to what we tried to do at Honeywell and what we've done, we were behind as a company versus other Western companies in 2002 in establishing a presence in China. And our analysts and investors were saying it. My staff felt the same way. And I got a lot of advice to go fast and do acquisitions and joint ventures in order to expand our China presence quickly. I was uncomfortable with that because I wanted to make sure that we established the right kind of culture and that we would be doing something that made sense for the long term and not just trying to focus on how to get something done right away. So I ignored all that advice and instead focused on building our China organization, which was only about 1,000 people at the time. And I want to say it was $200 or $300 million in sales, not that big. So it was a much slower beginning. And for the first 3 or 4 years, it was tough to see much of an impact because we were just building things. And as you know, by the time I left, China was about 3 billion in sales for us, and we had about 13,000 employees. Yeah. Just by doing it with that kind of slow, steady, just keep growing. And unlike a lot of Western companies who all maintained they could grow sales in China, but there was no profitability, our margin in China was higher than it was in the US because we did everything to be a Chinese company. And we promoted from within. We hired great people. We paid them well. And we made sure that they embodied the Honeywell culture. And you've heard me tell this story, perhaps. The first leader we had in China, we had 1,000 people, and I said, I want you to hire 500 new people next year. They maintained how difficult that was, and then said, well, the values, the behaviors you want to see are not part of the Chinese culture. We're not going to be able to hire people consistent with the Honeywell values. So I said, how many people in China? He said, 1.3 billion. I said, okay, does everybody in China think the same way? Well, of course not, was the answer. So I asked, is there a chance there are 500 people out of that 1.3 billion who think this way, consistent with the Honeywell culture we want? Yes. I said, well, find me those people. We ended up, out of 13,000 people, we only had around 75 expatriate employees from all different countries, US, Germany, UK, Malaysia, everywhere. And everybody else was Chinese, so that, and all the business leaders were Chinese, so that people in the organization could see, I can get the top job here at Honeywell. It's not always going to be somebody who comes in from the outside. And I would say there are two answers to how to do it. One is to say, I can't really trust anybody over there. I need all my own people, and they all have to be in charge. The other is, my people don't know anything about that country, so I need to hire all local people. And I think both of those are wrong. And especially in the beginning, you want to find somebody who can go into that country and understands your culture and what it is you're trying to do. And then they need to make sure that they hire local people consistent with that culture, and make sure that they build the capability of that organization and of those people, so that over time, more authority can be given to the local people. And the reason we were so successful in China is because we developed that local capability. So when it came to general management, key staff functions, manufacturing capability, design authority, so that they truly had responsibility for designs that were going to be in the China market, the purchasing people, so that our business actually got the China price for China companies, not the China price for Western companies. That made a big difference for our success as an organization. So what you're trying to do is build that local capability, that local flexibility to be able to respond quickly to local demands, while still retaining that cultural tie to the mother company, if that all makes sense.
You know, China has huge human resources. If you go to Mexico or Southeast Asia, do you still always find enough capability employees?
So far, yes. It may take a little more work to find them. We always did. I can't say it was ever a problem.
Actually, we sent 2 reporters to Mexico to report Chinese companies in Mexico. What then get back is the biggest problem is Chinese managers cannot find enough good person.
We used to hear there's not enough engineering capability in Mexico. Well, we found that there actually was quite a bit of good engineering talent in Mexico. Sometimes they needed to be further trained in our processes and some of the capabilities that we wanted to see developed. But we found very good people in Mexico. And we have terrific people down there in manufacturing and engineering, sales. They're definitely there. I can promise you that.
So another biggest problem is how to deal with the regulatory compliance challenges in strange market. How did you do when you're in the office, especially in strange culture, strange language market?
Yeah. Well, as is true with any government, if you're a business, you have to comply. So you have to understand what are those local regulations, whether it has to do with labor, product specifications, how you go to market, whatever those laws and regulations are, you have to comply. There's just no two ways about it. That is the answer. You have to comply. And that's why it's really important to have good local people who understand it in a way that none of us ever will, going into a country that we didn't grow up in. There's just that local dynamic that's important for local people to know and be able to convey to the foreign owner. This is how it's done here. Now, they're not always right, because sometimes they just want something to be a certain way, and it's not necessarily a regulatory item. So there is some judgment involved. But by and large, this can all be figured out if you have the right local people. And, I go back to my hiring example where I was told this is how Chinese people are, so the culture won't work. And you push on it a little bit and find out, well, that's not exactly true. They're really using it as an excuse to make their job easier. So you do have to make sure that's not happening. But at the end of the day, if it truly is a law or a regulation of some kind, you have to comply. It's as simple as that.
If I understand you rightly, what you mean is if you hire good people, you can lower the cost of compliance. Am I right?
Well, I would say it's not just lowering the cost of compliance. It's making sure you don't create a compliance issue for yourself, which is even more expensive. Because if a country finds out a foreign company has been doing something wrong or just ignored a regulation, that oftentimes doesn't work out too well. You're better off making sure that you comply and do it in as reasonable a way as possible. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is with good local people, good local law firms, people who can really help you understand what's important.
So it's a bad idea if you're trying to lowering the compliance cost. A lot of Chinese managers who working abroad told us that the cost of compliance is too much higher. They cannot bear it.
Well, first of all, you do have to comply. So that there's no two ways around that. But any local manager saying that, I would push on them a bit about what specifically is required in order to comply, and what would we need to change in order to be able to do that. I would make sure that, because sometimes it is something that's just defensive and that doesn't make sense. Other times it's something that makes sense for their local market and all the local competitors do it. Simple example, I can remember going into some countries where it was considered by our folks a regulatory burden for all the paperwork that went along with a product to be in the local language. Well, yeah, that is an additional burden, but it actually makes a lot of sense and is not a ridiculous request on the part of the local team or local customers. So I think it's important to really understand what is truly an onerous or ridiculous regulation that is too costly to comply with, and what is more of an excuse, because sometimes this is used as an excuse.
So in your 16 term of CEO, you never asked your members to cut the cost of compliance?
No,
never did?
I can't
Never.
say it ever came up as a question even. I mean, there were some markets because of entrenched local competitors where it was more difficult, like Japan, for example, or sometimes if there was a local competitor who was favored. But I can't say I ever participated in a conversation where the cost of compliance with local standards or local requirements ever caused us to walk away from anything or not do it. I don't remember ever having a single conversation like that in 16 years.
Another issue is in many Chinese companies, managers working abroad often cannot find a suitable position after backing into headquarters, which always lead to leave. It is unfair for those managers and hurt the company meanwhile. Have you ever seen such things in hardware?
Definitely. And
Yeah.
every company in every country, I think, runs into the same problem. So here's some things that we did at Honeywell to make sure that it wasn't a problem, because you do need to pay attention to it. And it's really ironic, but we encourage people to go to a foreign country and get that experience. And then we treat them like it wasn't a very useful experience for their career. So the thinking makes no sense, but it is prevalent. It's almost human nature. So what we did is we had a process called MRR, Management Resource Review, that did 3 times a year with every business, every function, going through people, organization, do we have the best leaders, what advice do we want to give them, all of that. One of the elements that we looked at in that MRR were foreign assignments, and number one, making sure that whoever we put into one of those jobs was somebody that the business wanted back in the US or Germany or whatever country they came from. That this wasn't just somebody where they said, yeah, he or she can do the job, because then that creates that problem. So you have to send really good people that a business doesn't want to see maybe go into a foreign country. The second piece of it is we tracked what was happening with these people, because they need to be able to come back into a very good job so that everybody looks at it and says, oh, it works. If I take a foreign assignment, I can end up in a better place than if I just stay where I am.
If you pick a person, you think he or she are very suitable for working abroad, but he or she refused you, what would you do in this situation?
Yeah, I never forced anybody to do anything, because circumstances differ. And if you have somebody who says, I would love to go, but my spouse refuses to leave the country, he or she just won't leave, so I can't go, I wasn't going to force that person to go and be away from their family for 2 or 3 years. That, I think, was just too difficult for some people. Others, it didn't matter so much, and they would say, yep, I want to go. My spouse doesn't want to go, but if I can go back and visit, spend a week, a month back at home, that would solve my problem. Then I would say, okay, I'm willing to do that. Because you don't want to put somebody who's unhappy from day one in a position. So they have to want to do it because these are difficult jobs. And if they go into the job not wanting to be there in the first place, you're probably not going to get a very good result.
Will it damage their promotion if they refuse to go abroad?
Not generally. I can think of only one instance in 16 years where it did hurt somebody's career because they were given the opportunity to do a really big job in a foreign country that was a test for them to see could they run something that big. Because I was contemplating a lot of things with succession and they refused to do it, saying the job was too risky. And that made me nervous about that person. And I said, well, if they're not willing to take on a challenge, knowing what it could lead to, because they perceive it as too risky, then that's probably not a person I want to keep promoting. And I thought, okay, I need to start thinking about this person differently. But that's the only one I can think of in 16 years.
So, do you really think that the US has lost manufacturing? I checked the data yesterday and found the US shares 16% global manufacturing value added in 2024, only after China.
Yes, there's no doubt that the spirit of globalization in the 90s and in this century, that there were manufacturing jobs lost. A lot of manufacturing did move offshore. Those were not all bad decisions. Some of them were, but not all of them. And there are certain key industries that I think are important for a large nation in particular to be able to be self-sufficient or close to it. I do think we went a bit too far in that, and that needs to be addressed. But like we were saying before, there's a sweet spot you want to hit. You don't want to say everything needs to be local or everything needs to be global. You need to be very thoughtful about how you go about doing that. The problem, of course, is that when politicians and voters get involved, it's easier to make the all one way or all the other conversation, as opposed to saying it's as productive as possible. It uses global supply chain effectively, but also maintains the right amount of self-sufficient within a country. And that's a judgment call that has to be made, which makes it more difficult. But you don't want to take it back so far.
Could you specify that you mentioned self-sufficient? Which industry, which product do you think the US must self-sufficient and the others shouldn't do that?
In defense, for example, you probably want to make sure that you can produce it within your own country, whatever it is. Other things, where as long as you can be working with nations for supply that you can regard as unlikely to ever create a problem for you, then you can rely on those nations. So again, there's no all or nothing answer to any of this.
So how do you view the moment of that manufacturing back to America? I did some research on this issue, and I'm surprised that actually President Obama called this issue in 2010, and 15 years has passed. The issue is become more and more serious. So I'm curious, what's your view about that?
It's going to be consistent with what we were just talking about. It depends upon what it is you're doing. For example, to produce textiles or clothing in the US, I just don't think will make any sense under any scenario. All it will do is increase costs for everybody, for all US citizens, and will hurt the countries that are actually making those textiles today. When it comes to the technology sector, that's probably be important to be able to produce in the US or with very friendly allies, countries, in order to make sure you've got the certainty of supply.
If you want to achieve the aim of reindustrialization, is tariff helpful?
I would say the jury is out on that one.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to wait to see where all these negotiations end up. I do think the US was much more accommodating coming out of World War II, and rightfully, because the world had been destroyed. And you need to figure out a way to get the world back working again, people more prosperous, economies able to thrive. And that was quite successful. But like anything else, things have to evolve. And there was an advantage given to most countries relative to the US. And those countries are doing very well now. And it's time to get that more into balance than it was before. The tariffs are an attempt to do that, to get everybody's attention. The global system has changed significantly over the last 70 years. So what do we need to do differently in order to create a better balance? We have to see how it works out. Personally, I'm optimistic because I think most countries recognize that there was an imbalance and that needs to be addressed. And we end up with global growth that adds to the prosperity of people everywhere.
Yeah. To follow up this question, I'd like to ask again, do you think reindustrialization a pragmatic aim for America?
Again, yes, having greater sufficiency in manufacturing industries is important. At the same time, we need to recognize that the Industrial Revolution is pretty much worked its way through. And we're now 40 years into what's the digital revolution. And it's equally important in the US that we do everything we can to support that digital revolution. And you think back 100 years ago, politicians looked at the industrial age and said, we need people to be able to read and write in order to support this industrial era. So in the US, there was a big push on that and keeping kids in school all the way through high school so that they could read, write, do math effectively to make us competitive in the industrial age. Well, we're now in the digital era, and it's important to not just focus on the past and with the need to have industrial capability, but to also recognize the future is digital, and there will be a strong interplay between digital and industrial. And as much as everybody is talking about AI today, 20 years from now, it's going to be something else within that digital construct. And every country, I think, to be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. If the US want to strengthen the manufacturing, what are the weaknesses of it, in your view?
Well, the only one I could think of it would be a possible barrier is cost. Because generally, the reason for offshoring something was related to cost.
So do you think technology such as AI could solve the cost problem in the future?
I don't know that it solves it. Maybe reduce the cost some, but I would expect there will be an overall cost increase with reshoring, as they call it, to come back to the US. Just because labor is more expensive here, and labor is generally 30 to 40% of the overall cost of a product. So if you increase the cost of labor by 5 or 10 times, that's generally going to be an issue.